Welcome back to Backspace Academy. In this lecture and follow-up lab, we're going to be looking at how we can connect to our AWS services and resources using a command line interface. So instead of having to use the AWS Management Console as we've done before, we can use text commands to achieve a lot of what we would normally do with that graphical user interface. We'll start off by looking at the back-end service that makes this happen, and that is the AWS Application Programming Interface, or API for short. Then we'll look at the number of different command line interface applications that we can install on our computer that will allow remote access to those services and resources. We'll also look at the AWS Cloud9 service, and we'll discuss why I primarily use this for anything to do with a command line interface and the security concerns around not using AWS Cloud9. And finally, we'll finish up by having a lab on using the Cloud9 service with the command line interface. When you're using the AWS Management Console like we've done in the past, AWS uses a application programming interface to enable that communication between your remote computer and the AWS services and resources. So how that works is that the AWS Management Console that you've been using is simply an application that is running on your browser, and it is sending HTTP calls backwards and forwards to this application programming interface backend on AWS. Now, the documentation is available for the AWS API for many services. For example, for the S3 API, for the EC2 Query API, but not for everything. So if you wanted to create your own application and there wasn't a software development kit for that language you're using, I can't imagine what language that would be, because there's certainly a very broad range of software development kits that are available, but it is possible for you to send HTTP calls to the API, provided you have that authentication done beforehand to actually do that. So it provides that back-end mechanism for that communication, and it's utilized again by the AWS Management Console. And we'll also use it with the AWS command line interface. So that again is an application that's running on your remote computer that will be sending HTTP calls to this API back end. Also, there are a number of software development kits that wrap the API up into libraries that can be used with, for example, JavaScript for PHP and Python and the like. And so you don't have to actually know how to do these HTTP calls. You just need to know how to use that software development kit. And the documentation for that is, of course, brilliant. And many other AWS services also use the API for communication within the AWS cloud. API calls to AWS can only be made by authenticated users with valid security credentials. For example, if you're using the Management Console, you would have been authenticated through your username and password. If you're using the command line interface application on a remote computer, then you would need to download an access key ID and secret and use that for authentication with AWS. If you're using an application on your browser that has been developed using one of the many AWS software development kits, then normally you would be issued with IAM temporary credentials. So what that means is that this application that you have may use login for Google, may use login for Facebook or whatever, and it might use your Google account or your Facebook account to authenticate you, and then that will be issuing temporary credentials for you to access the AWS resources through that browser-based application. And finally, we can actually log all of these API calls using the AWS CloudTrail service. So that's great if we have any security issues or any performance issues. We can go back through those CloudTrail logs and make sure that there's nothing untoward going on there. A picture tells 1,000 words. So how does this all work? Down the bottom there, we've got our AWS cloud that we want to connect to using our remote computer. And so that remote computer will be sending HTTPS API calls to the AWS cloud to get information from the AWS cloud and to issue instructions to the AWS services. So the first way we can do it there is we could have an IAM user, and that user will have an username and password. And they can use that username and password to log in to the AWS Management Console that is running inside of their browser. And the AWS Management Console running on that remote computer will then issue those API calls to the AWS cloud. The second option there is that we could have an IAM user download IAM credentials in the form of an access key and a secret to go with that access key. And so if that is presented to the AWS command line interface application that is running on that remote computer, that will authenticate that IAM user, and that IAM user will then be able to issue command line interface commands to the AWS cloud. And finally, if we've got an external user, so this user doesn't have an AWS account. For example, you might have an application like Dropbox, for example, and you have millions of users, and it's not practical, or it's actually not even possible to create 1 million IAM users. So you need to be able to somehow authenticate those users and to allow those users to temporarily access the AWS cloud. So you would use an application that is running using the software development kits, and that application could authenticate you using an OAuth authentication service. For example, it could use the AWS Cognito service. It could use Google, log in with Google, or log in with Facebook to authenticate you. And from that authentication, you will have limited and temporary access through that remote computer to the AWS cloud. Now, to start using the command line interface, the first thing that you need to do is that you need to have an application running on your computer that can allow that to happen. So the AWS standard CLI application, it's available for download for Windows, Mac, and Linux. And it allows those API commands to be sent to AWS using the Windows command line or a Linux or Mac terminal application. There is also the AWS Shell application, which is a cross-platform standalone integrated shell environment that is written in Python that can provide even more features and more automation features to the CLI application. And finally, we've also got the AWS tools for Windows PowerShell. So you can run CLI commands within Windows PowerShell and at the same time use all of those automation tools that are available within PowerShell. Now, if you want to have a look at all of those CLI tools that are available, just go to the AWS website, aws.amazon.com/CLI. AWS Cloud Shell is a shell environment that is accessed through the AWS Management Console. It has the AWS Command Line Interface application pre-installed. Now, this provides significantly increased security as opposed when you use the Command Line Interface application and run that on your remote computer. Because when you do that, you need to download and use the IAM credentials. Now, when you use AWS Cloud Shell, you're simply logging into the Management Console. Now, you could argue that that is just as insecure because you could lose your username and password. But coming up further in the course, we're going to learn about multi-factor authentication that we can apply to our account so that our account cannot be accessed with simply a user name or password. AWS Cloud9 IDE is an integrated development environment running on an EC2 instance, and you access that through the AWS Management Console. It also has the AWS CLI application pre-installed, and it also provides that increased security because, again, the IAM credentials are not saved on a remote computer. One advantage that it has over the simple Cloud Shell is that it also has a tree view of the file structure of that EC2 instance. So if you want to upload files and manipulate those files and maybe put them into a S3 bucket or something like that, and you want to do that all with the command line interface, then you can quite simply just do a drag and drop from your Windows Explorer or the Mac equivalent of that. Just drag and drop over to the tree and those files will be automatically transferred over using SFTP. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our discussion on the command line interface. Coming up next, we're going to be getting our hands on with the command line interface. So I look forward to seeing you in the lab. Welcome back to Backspace Academy. In this lab on AWS Cloud Shell, we'll have a look at using the command line interface to connect remotely into the AWS service, and we're going to use that to create a bucket just using a simple text command. Now, before we start, make sure that you've downloaded a copy of the command line interface lab notes that come with this course. So we start off, we don't go looking for any console or anything like that. Just up here in the middle of the screen at the top here is a little icon for Cloud Shell, just next to the alarm button there. And if we click on that, that will open the Cloud Shell for us. Okay. So it's going to have a lot of pre-installed tools. We've got the AWS CLI. It's also got Python and Node.js installed on there as well. Okay, we'll just click on Do Not Show That Again and close. Now, if we want to send any commands using the AWS or using the AWS command line interface, we start with AWS and then the command afterwards. So we're just going to do version. So dash version, it'll tell us what version we've got. Also tell us whether or not it's been installed. There we go. So we've got the command line interface installed. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to use the command line interface to create a bucket. So just make sure that we put something very unique. So I don't know what the names of my buckets are now. So I'm just going to put something that's going to start with some zeros so I can find it easy enough. And a bit of rubbish afterwards there. So the command we're doing there is AWS and then S3 and then MB for make bucket and then the URL for that bucket. So S3 : / and then the name of that bucket. So if we enter, we should make ourselves a bucket there. So it's made a bucket. There we go. So if we go to the S3 management console now, we should be able to see that bucket. There we go. There is our bucket that we created, which is pretty good. So that's all I want to show you for now using the command line interface. Coming up in the next lab, we'll use the Cloud9 IDE. It's a little bit more powerful. We can do a lot more things with it. So for now, we'll just clean this up because we're not going to use this bucket at all. So just delete this. And delete that bucket.
And we'll just close out of the Cloud Shell as well. Okay, coming up next, we'll have a go at using the Cloud9 IDE, using the AWS command line interface as well within that. Look forward to seeing you in the next one. Welcome back to Backspace Academy. In this lab, we're going to be launching a Cloud9 integrated development environment. And from that, we're going to be communicating to the Amazon S3 service using the command line interface. And also we're going to be transferring files across into our development environment and using that to communicate again and transfer files using the command line interface into Amazon S3. Now, before we start the lab, make sure that you've got a copy of the AWS Command Line Interface lab notes. The chapter we're going through is creating a Cloud9 development environment on EC2. So starting off, we need to go to the Cloud9 Management Console, and of course we search for that up here. And there it is there. If we haven't used AWS Cloud9 before, we will have this introductory page here. We can click on Create Environment, or we can just open this hamburger icon up here, and we can go to Your Environments, which will take us back to there, and we can create our environment. We'll give our environment a name. I won't worry about a description. Now, the Cloud9 service, it runs on an EC2 instance, so you will be paying for that EC2 instance. It will be, of course, covered under the free tier if we select a T2 Micro. And what happens when you stop using that in the browser, it will, after a short amount of time, what you can set is normally 30 minutes, but you can change that if you want to. When you're not using it, it will automatically go into hibernation and go into a stop mode, so you won't be getting billed for that, other than the cost of storage. But again, a T2 Micro is covered under the free tier. So we're going to use Amazon Linux 2. And here's our cost saving settings. So after 30 minutes, it's going to go into hibernation and save us costs. And I'm just going to leave that as it is there and click on Next Step. Okay, so they recommend some best practices for Cloud9. Use source control, regularly update your software, turn on CloudTrail, only share your environment with trusted users. All good advice there. Let's click on Create Environment. Now, because it's an EC2 instance, it's going to take quite some time for that to launch and to set itself up. So I'm going to go away, have a cup of coffee. I'm going to come back and it should be all done. Okay, so after about 5 or 10 minutes, our Cloud9 environment has launched. So what we've got here on the left is going to be our file structure there. So if we want to put any files in or create folders, we can do that. So we can just click on here and we can create a folder here, create a new file, or put a new file in or new folder. If we want to drag and drop files on here, we can do that, or we can just go to File and then we can upload local files. And that's quite good. And if we want to launch just say for example, we put in a new folder in here, and we wanted to launch a terminal from that new folder or inside of that new folder, we could just do Open Terminal here, and it'll open that terminal there. There we go. So it's put that into new folder. So we're now in the new folder in the terminal. So you don't have to navigate around using the terminal. You can just right click and go in there. So I'm just going to close out of that. Now down the bottom here, we've got another terminal screen here, or bash screen. And that is the same thing, but that's going to be located here. So I'm just going to get rid of that folder. And we delete that. Okay, so let's start sending some command line interface commands to the S3 service again, like we did before. So we're just going to paste this in. And let's make a bucket. So the AWS S3 and then MB. And I'm going to give it 4 zeros. and then my name. So of course it needs to be something unique, but make sure it is something that you can remember. Don't put a whole heap of scrambled stuff, because we're going to have to type it out again, and we're going to have to find it as well. So something easy to remember. Okay, so it's made that bucket, and I'm sure if we go back and look at it, it will be there. Now, one big advantage, I think, of using the Cloud9 IDE is how easy and simple it is to just drag and drop files over to this EC2 instance or this Cloud9 environment. So what I'm going to do now is just drag and drop a file onto this backspace lab here. Okay, so just drag and drop, make sure it's highlighted there, and I'll drop that on there. And here we can see now it's uploading that file. So that'll take a while to upload, and then we'll be able to do something with it. Okay, so that's finished copying over, and there we can see the CLI.pdf file that I copied over is now on that environment. So what's actually happened is that we have this EC2 instance that is running the Cloud9 IDE, and if you go into the EC2 management console, you will be able to see that there is an EC2 instance there that has been launched, and it will have a description of the AWS Cloud9 IDE. And when you're not using that, it will just go into hibernation mode. What we can do now that we've got this file on this EC2 instance, we can do things with it. We can send it to Amazon S3, for example, or we could send it to Amazon EFS or something like that. What we're going to do is, seeing as we're using Amazon S3, we'll copy it over to Amazon S3 to that bucket that we just created. So the command, AWS, oops, I better go into the console, AWS, and then S3, and then the command is copy CP, then we put the name of the file, and then the location of the bucket that it's got to go to. Okay, so AWS, S3 to get the S3 commands, CP to copy it over, the name of the file, and where we're copying it to, the bucket that we're copying it to, and enter. So there we go. So that worked fine. There was no errors. So if we go into the S3 management console now, we'll be able to find that. Okay, so we'll go to S3. And there's our bucket. And there's our file inside the bucket. So that's pretty good. So I'm just going to clean this all up now. So that was a pretty good lab. We've transferred files over, put them into a bucket. You did that all with the command line interface. Pretty good. Okay, so I'll just clean this up. We'll empty this bucket out. And empty that. Okay, so that worked. And now we can delete that bucket. Okay, so we could shut this down if we wanted to. I'm just going to leave it there. It's going to shut itself down anyway. After half an hour or so, it'll shut itself down. So that brings us to the end of the lab. Hope you got a lot out of that, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.